To go from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the wealthiest is remarkable, and also to modernize without westernizing is also something that is quite appealing to a number of countries.
在萨尔茨堡全球的节目里，参专内尔从东南亚视角谈中国，发展中国家看中国，不只看制度标签，还要看发展能不能真正落地。
Well, what do you want people to understand? Again, what's the misunderstanding here that you thought you need to correct?
Well, I think all of us who have, you've lived in China. I first went to China in 1989, 1990. I stayed in the Beijing hotel, and as you well described, there's hardly any heating. You didn't get the keys to your room, etc. And so I think the misunderstanding is profound. But the ones that, and I want to keep this politically neutral in terms of my observation here. The misunderstanding, and I've written the book on the basis of my lived experience as well of China and watching the world at large. And the misunderstanding that somehow China is some sort of tyranny, run by a bunch of autocrats, and that there is no freedoms at all, and that it continues to be a place in which people can't flourish, and that the state is all powerful, and that it cheats, etc. All of those things that we've heard about. You've even, I think, rightly said that in Europe and in the USA, there's a feeling that China has grown at their expense, which is a rather sort of rich thing for Europeans and Americans to accuse another country of. So to try and get people to understand that this is a civilizational state, profound in its understanding of its role in the world, clearly with shortcomings too, and the book does explain those shortcomings, but it is a civilizational state that is essentially recognized its past failings and where it was too weak, and it had to create stability. And through a system of meritocracy, which I described in the book in terms of the governance systems, etc., rooted in its civilization and culture, has embraced the world. And I also think it's important, and I again want to be politically neutral here, get people to understand that the evidence to date is that China is not a state looking to essentially, and there are people who will look at things like Tibet and all of those things. And these are issues to be talked about, but China is not an expansionist state that the rest of us will have concerns about its size, particularly us in Southeast Asia. But I don't think there's a view, and this needs to be shared, that, China's going to come and take over Malaysia or Vietnam and things like that. So that's also very important to understand. And that's what I wanted people to understand. And it's like any other government going to any other state going through a huge amount of challenges and trying to, raise the well-being of its people and meeting all sorts of challenges in a very complex, globalized world. Yeah, I mean, I think I do understand it, but I don't necessarily agree with it. Particularly someone like me who's comes from Southeast Asia, a citizen of a former colony. And those are, first of all citizens of former colonies. We don't take kindly to the view that suddenly the West, and who represent less than 15% of the world population, suddenly feel they're getting a raw deal. Well, we got a raw deal for 4 centuries. And so that sort of doesn't sit comfortably with my analysis, nor do I think it sits comfortably with any of us, including my colleagues of the Club of Rome, that is something to be, we can understand it, but the political climate in the West. And I was asked this question in an interview I did about the book a few weeks ago, where I was said, why don't they understand China? And I said, the political elite actually understand. Not only do they understand China, they understand the world has changed. What they have is great fear that the privileges they have enjoyed. And this, I'm making a political point, but I think in relation to your question, it's important.
Well, let's talk about that rise and peacefully. This brings up a question in many parts of Europe and the US as to what does China want? There is a perception in many parts of the West that China wants to replace the United States as the world's dominant hegemonic power. You make the case in the book that that is not the case. You mentioned here that China is not expansionist. So let's get to the bottom line. What do you think China wants to be in the 21st century?
I think I say in the book as well, and Eric, you as, I would say, a scholar of Chinese history and geopolitics and current, notions of where China wants to go will understand. China has explicitly said that it does not want to replace the United States. It has no interest in that. But what I think I try to portray in the book is China is cognizant that it is a very big and now a very powerful country, but especially in terms of its economic clout, in terms of the impact that its growth has on other countries, both positively and also negatively. And it has to be cautious about that. And then thirdly, in terms of its technological prowess, etc. So the question for China is really, and I say in the book that China is trying to cross the river while feeling the stones, what do? We've never been in this position. Of course, it was a dominant economy about 200 years ago together with India, and we all know that. But the world was a very different place 200 years ago. There's about 1 billion people in the world. We have 8 billion people. What does this look like? And my view is China is trying to figure this out. But what I understand and try to describe in the book is that it is very, very dangerous. And then say others are going to behave the same like we do and just superimpose that trajectory of dominance. And I have said this before, that one of the concerns, and we need leaders in the United States and Europe to arise, new leaders who begin to reflect that not everyone's going to behave like us, and dismantle this fear that others will do to us what we did to them. And I think what China wants is primarily to have a stable world. And that civilizational state, as you know, is based on harmony. Can China maintain that harmony internally and then internationally, given that it is also a growing economy and its appetite for resources will be huge? And I think that's the biggest threat. When it wants resources, will it do it in a way that allows it to rise peacefully and not disadvantage others? And I've said this to Chinese officials whenever I met them, particularly to do with resources in Africa, Southeast Asia, fisheries, etc.
You talk about in the book the economic transformation and this pick up on this idea of the resources. Now, according to kind of recent economic history, when countries, transition from agrarian to light industry to manufacturing, heavy industry, then they eventually get into tech and services and leave behind those lower end industries. That's what we saw in Korea, in Japan, Taiwan. It's happening here in Southeast Asia as well. As they move up the value chain, it gets too costly to do the low end part of the manufacturing process. What makes China unique here, though, and it's unprecedented in many respects, is that as they're moving up the value chain, making some of the most advanced telecommunications, new energy, automation, EVs, all of this, they're still holding on to making the flip-flops, the t-shirts, and ceramics, for example, at the low end. Now, China's facing a number of challenges at the same time that you also bring up in the book in terms of demographics and its population that doesn't really want to work in factories too much anymore. Talk to us about the challenges of holding on to the bottom end of the manufacturing at the same time as undergoing a demographic change where there may not be enough people or a will to work in those low-end jobs.
Yeah, I think I'll be careful as I frame this, but that whole narrative that you just described, again, came from the neoliberal economic model of the West, right? That this is how economics works, this is how countries work. And I think China is actively seeking to break that for its own self, for the reasons you described, so that they don't leave behind these people and then get a whole disenfranchised, as you pointed out. And I went to China and saw in the previous life I had as a consultant doing a lot of due diligence, etc., the arrival of the investments in China, the due diligence being done, the conversion of the state enterprises to these joint ventures with companies like GE and all of those. And China went along that because it had to lift as many people as possible. Then we saw the peak of manufacturing, which I'm sure you're very well versed in. And I think, it depending on how you want to look at the numbers, it peaked maybe about 15 years ago, the peak of manufacturing. And then we saw people essentially having to move back to the rural areas. And then you saw the Chinese policy of revitalization of the rural areas, putting very smart people to it. I think this is a challenge for all our countries. As a Southeast Asian and as a Malaysian, I warn our governments about the sort of, single track trajectory towards tech dominated economies and forgetting the most basic things. And so I think, as you said, sticking to the lower end is important, but more importantly, what I see is redefining what meaningful employment looks like, and therefore what fiscal and monetary policy can look like in the Chinese context. So in that sense, I think you will agree with me that for many parts of the world, the trajectory with regard to where climate is going, what all the resource constraints are doing, means that one of the most important industries going forward will be actually food production and food security. And that cannot hinge on the industrial model that was exported around the world and perfected, particularly in the United States. We're going to have to do something different because we have to use labor with all the population that we have in the rural areas and use labor as an input rather than the entire mechanization and chemicalization of our food supply chains. So I think the Chinese system is looking and acutely aware that while it is on this trajectory, and I don't think it should compete with the United States or any other country for tech dominance, what for? It is aware that it has to be part of what that technology looks like. The most important thing is, what will people do meaningfully for work? How will they be paid? And I think there are lots of other possibilities in terms of how you look at fiscal and monetary policy. You could pay people to actually plant trees and clean up the rivers, just in this analogy for Southeast Asia, etc. But food security is going to be very important in rural revitalization. So I think that's the thing. And we don't know how that script's going to look like. And I believe China is the first country, because it's large, is going to have to do that.
So if the Prime Minister of Malaysia, the President of Vietnam, the President of Botswana come to you and say, Chandran, you studied China. What is the lesson that we can take from what China did to apply to our countries in the global south that are still heavily agrarian, much the way that China was back in the late 1970s when paramount leader Deng Xiaoping started the reform and opening up period? What would you tell them based on your book and your life experiences?
No, that's a great question, Eric. And, in fact, before I even thought about this book and with my colleagues, I wrote a book, which you might probably know is called The Sustainable State. And that's formed the genesis of much of my arguments and about where our region and developing countries in Africa go. And I would say to your question first, China has succeeded, and I believe all countries need to succeed, not using the China model, but the principles of essentially, in the era we live in, of having a strong state. But by that, in the West, it's typically seen as being authoritarian, but essentially a competent state capable of long-term planning. And so when I talk about the book, that the Chinese strength has been meritocracy, and that's also civilizational. And we've had we've had a series of global conversations that we've done around China, where we've had Chinese experts and others talk about and something that I would like people to understand in this conversation about the importance that the Chinese place on meritocracy. And I won't compare it with leaders from Europe or USA, but most of those people would not qualify to even get up to a provincial level governor. So the first is meritocracy and competence right through government. And I can give you a lot of examples of, with different countries. You can go to a small town in China, you meet the mayor, as he or she is 40 years old, PhD in economics and a first degree in chemical engineering or something like that. So the best people go and work with the state. Second is essentially the whole issue of a communitarian view of the role of government and service. And this is a premium in China. There are certainly examples of people who have abused it. You and I know about that. But the fundamental thing is it's a society based on a communitarian system of governance, that you achieve results because you serve society and you do that. And third has been, in my view, and I know this as I travel through Southeast Asia, and people say, how do they deal with the corruption thing so well? And they all know that, especially in the last 12 years or 10 years with President Xi, there has been a real focus on getting rid of corruption. And so you take all of those three ingredients and you've got essentially what, in my view, and I've worked in Southeast Asia a lot. I also lived in Africa. I don't know if you're aware. And those are the conclusions I came to in my first book on the sustainable state. You need a strong state that is essentially based on competence, meritocracy, zero tolerance for corruption, and is communitarian and has a method and a governance system that essentially puts communitarian needs and the metrics in place to do that. And that, I think, is the China formula. And not many countries can follow that. Even my own country,
it's tough. It's tough.
Corruption is rampant, yet we are a smaller country, so it hasn't taken us down the drain. But it's a major problem in the country, and it's tough. You need political leadership. And there's a lot to be gained by working with China. And to the rest of the world, particularly Africa, etc., my message is China is in Africa now, and it can be a good partner. It's also up to you to make sure that the Chinese are accountable as they're helping you, and that, like any country is powerful, that doesn't take advantage of you. It's up to you. And in Southeast Asia, I think the message is, we in Southeast Asia, as you know, Eric, are more familiar with Chinese civilization because Chinese civilization is the diaspora and the civilization is right across. I was brought up with Chinese people, so I don't see Chinese as who are those people. For us is to essentially also do the same thing, which is to take advantage of Chinese economic power, partnership, etc., but also be cautious to make sure that China doesn't overstretch, given its size, protect our resources, have fair deals with the Chinese, and demand that those deals work in our favor rather than succumb to economic power. But to trust that, China is not an expansionist power, and work together with it and learn from it as well, not in terms of adopting its political model, but more importantly, the things I mentioned, the emphasis on meritocracy, competence, fighting corruption very hard, and being communitarian.
奈尔的分量不在于替中国宣布一个完美答案，他的提醒是，发展中国家不必照搬中国的政治形式，值得研究的是一个国家能不能把长期目标变成持续建设。这不是把强国家说成抽象口号，对普通人来说，它最后要落到一份稳定工作，一项能长期维护的公共服务，和一个地方能否靠自己的产业改善生活。计划写得再漂亮，工厂不投产，项目没人管，发展就没有落点。中国经验引起外部兴趣，也因为它让一些国家看到，现代化并非只有一条通往西方社会的路。先把本国的土地、劳动力和现有产业看清楚，再决定该学什么，该谈什么合作。比复制任何模式都可靠。合作也不是把判断交出去。面对任何强国，项目是否公平，收益是否留在当地，决策是否由本国自己做，都该被检验。能保留选择，建设才有意义。